So we're here at MIT with Marsha Coleman-Adebayo. And who is she? Well, at the EPA, she was the first person that Black South Africans went to when they felt that U.S. corporations were poisoning their lives. She became responsible as a whistleblower for the creation of a whistleblower organization that ultimately led to the passage by consensus of the most powerful piece of civil rights legislation in the 21st century so far. She's written a book about it all. It's called No Fear, A Whistleblower's Triumph Over Corruption and Retaliation at the EPA. And I should say she has a bachelor's from Barnard and a PhD from right here. What a pleasure to meet you and to see you here at MIT.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back home.
It must take you back a little bit, but I want to take you back to somewhere else, which is your arrival in South Africa.
Yes.
Remind us what year it was, the atmosphere that you found yourself in, and did you think that this is kind of your dream job? Somebody who wrote about propaganda and Steve Biko and the struggle in South Africa,
right.
who'd worked at the EPA and the United Nations. There you are.
Well, not
on
only
the ground.
that, I was an anti-apartheid activist. I mean, I marched in front of the South African embassy for 2 years to free Nelson Mandela. And at one point, the EPA asked me to be the EPA liaison to the White House to assist the Nelson Mandela government in transitioning to quote-unquote liberation. So I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I was so excited. And as I record in my book, my first day in South Africa was quite eventful. You know, I actually saw someone murdered on the streets of South Africa the very first day that I arrived.
And this was soon after the end of apartheid, soon after Nelson Mandela's release.
Well, this is 1996.
A few years
A
later.
few years later. After getting over watching someone murdered in front of me, we got to work, quite frankly. And what I was astounded by was just the complete and total control by the Afrikaners of the government still, even though Nelson Mandela was in many ways symbolically the president. The country was still in the hands of Afrikaners and the white power structure.
Now, what was your mission? You were working there for Al Gore's special commission to South Africa on behalf of the EPA.
Right.
What did you understand your job was going to be?
My understanding was that my job was to assist the Black South Africans to transition into power, to help them understand what we had learned at the EPA over so many decades in terms of how to put together an effective environmental protection program. My understanding is that I was to work with them on water resources and solid waste management and provide training to the new cadre of South African leaders. That's what they told me my job was to.
And then a man called Jacob walked into your life.
A man named Jacob Ungukani walks into my life. Actually, in Boston, I brought a group of South African new environmental leaders to Cambridge to study at MIT, of all places. There was a great deal of fanfare at EPA because one of my supervisors said, why are we going to waste a place like MIT on these kind of people? And insulted, but I just sort of kept moving, and we were able somehow to bring them here. And one of the first things that Jacob said to me as he landed, literally, we're in the airport, and he comes straight at me, and he says, there are a group of people in South Africa dying from vanadium pentoxide, and if you don't do something about it, my entire stay in this country is a total waste of time. Well, that got my attention.
We'll get to what vanadium is and what happened
Right.
and what could still be happening.
What is still happening.
We don't
Right.
see the change that you fought for. But to stick with your life for a moment, to speed through this, you end up being the subject of death threats,
Right.
calls at home, calls at your office.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that experience.
What's terrifying? Unexpected from an agency that has like a little hippie-like logo. You certainly don't expect that. When I found out about vanadium and found out what our role was, the U.S. government role was, in assisting the U.S. multinational to produce this at the at the level of life-threatening job situations in South Africa, I started making a lot of noise. I had to make a lot of noise. And it was very clear from the very beginning that that was not going to be tolerated at the EPA. And so what I decided to do was to reach out to NGOs that I thought could assist, that could play their role as citizens, quite frankly, in the political process, and ask them to also ask questions about what was going on. It became pretty clear, I think, to my supervisors that some of the letters coming in, I had direct knowledge about the letters. And I was threatened and told to basically stop working with NGOs and to be a team player at EPA. When I refused to do that and I filed a complaint against the agency, all of a sudden my life just turned into a living hell. I started receiving terrible phone calls at my desk at EPA. And the phone calls would go something like, don't be surprised when you're going home and you put your foot on the accelerator that you get a big bang. So I used to have EPA security guards walk me to my car at night. I think the most terrifying time was when someone called me at home and said, your daughter has on this colored top and your son is wearing this colored pants. And I don't think I heard anything else. I just ran to the door, called my children in, and said, you can't play outside anymore.
Now this was before the mobilization for the law.
Yes.
It became called the No Fear Act.
Right. Well, this is around 1999, 2000, right before I went to court.
And that complaint that you brought, the organizing that you did,
Yes.
produced what really was the first new piece of civil rights legislation in the 21st century.
Exactly. It was the first civil rights legislation built on, however, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But what was clear is that we were living in almost an altered state at the EPA, but not just at the EPA, the entire federal government. Because one of the things that I found out as I began to organize is that EPA was not an isolated agency. That what was going on at EPA was going on throughout the entire federal government. That the federal government in many ways operates like a quasi-military organization, basically taking people out who do not follow the discipline of the government.
Now it's interesting that you would be accused of not being a team player, because to back up, you write about it in your book, and we're talking with Marsha Coleman-Adebayo, whose book is No Fear. You go back and you talk about your first days at EPA, where it was very clear that you were of a different team. You were treated differently. Talk about that.
Well, EPA reminded me of a 21st century plantation, not a 15th century, but a 21st century plantation, where everyone is supposed to know where you belong in the hierarchy and also on the racial scale. And we were really the first generation of African American professionals to work at the EPA. And so I think my white counterparts were really having a tough time trying to figure out, well, who are these people? And they're coming in with degrees from MIT, from Princeton, and a lot of my colleagues came in from state schools. And so they were really having a tough time. And so they were trying very hard to lock us into a paradigm that was digestible for them. And so one of the first things that they did was just try to humiliate us out of existence. It was very clear that we were to be seen and not heard.
And they would say things like, you can sit at this meeting if you behave like a white man, or we'll treat you like a white man for the purpose of this meeting.
Yeah, the exact quote was, you can come into the meeting. We feel comfortable with you because you remind me, or something like that, of a white man. You seem like a white man to me.
You'll be an honorary white man.
You're an honorary white man. At first, to be honest with you, I was so shocked because I had never heard anything like that before. And then when I didn't respond appropriately, then they took off the clubs, and I was called the B word. I was called an uppity N-word. I was called all kinds of various names, and that I think was to sort of bring me into tow and to make sure that I understood where my place was at the table.
And in retrospect, how do you connect the bias and discrimination that you witnessed and experienced at EPA, kind of run of the mill, And what happened to you afterwards? The way you were treated when you tried to report on the activities of the mining company, and frankly, the way that you were treated once you blew the whistle.
I try to connect the dots in the book between the racism I experienced at the EPA and the way they viewed the vanadium mine workers as disposable, as nuisance, as people who could just be replaced at a whim of a white supervisor. I mean, there was very little difference between the way I was being treated, except that I wasn't going into a mine every day, but I was certainly going into a hostile work environment every day that caused incredible havoc on my personal health as well as the health of my family. I was seen in many ways as a vanadium worker, but I was working for the United States government. And the question is, how do we see you? How do we get the product that you can produce? But we don't need for you to be a viable partner. And you certainly should not feel good about yourself or think that you're worthy to sit at the table with us.
I said I would ask about vanadium. And what is it? If I would look around my home, would I see vanadium?
Everywhere. Henry Ford said that vanadium was the undergirding of the American Industrial Revolution. Why? Because vanadium is literally what supports our lifestyle in this country. The CIA says that it's a strategic metal that the United States would consider committing military forces to ensure that we have access to it. That's how important vanadium is. So where is it? Refrigerators, cars, laptops, jewelry, airplanes, you name it. If it has steel in it, most likely it has vanadium in it. And 80% of all the vanadium that we have in this country comes from that small community in South Africa.
Is vanadium mined in the US and Europe?
It was mined in Colorado in 1930s, 1940s. And because of some of the health effects, it was stopped. But now, they've now applied for new license. They've also applied for license in British Columbia.
And what are the effects on the local people?
Dramatic. Vanadium pentoxide is extremely toxic. When I first started studying vanadium, it was mostly men. Unfortunately, now we have women mining vanadium and no epidemiological studies to determine the impact on their reproductive health. But for men, at first, it was within 6 months to a year, it was impotence. Then they start bleeding from every orifice, their eyes, their ears, they defecate blood, they urinate blood. They develop cancers of the kidney and liver, the esophagus, the stomach. Their tongues turn green, sometimes brown, sometimes black as an indication of poisoning. So at that point, they are completely poisoned. And once they're no longer able to sustain their jobs in the mine, they're fired and they're sent home for their wives and children to take care of them. So all the money that they've saved now goes to supporting their final days. And so when I went there, I was really quite naive when I was asking about vanadium and what we should do about it and how we could help these people. And I was told immediately to shut up.
You didn't shut up. Was it ever an option? Was silence ever an option?
Never. It never was. Most whistleblowers don't know that they're blowing the whistle. You're just asking a question. It's really what comes after the question that turns you into a whistleblower. Because everything, all the resources of the agency are coalesced to keep you, to shut you up.
And who was it responsible for shutting you up? Who was sending the message, this woman's investigation, her lobbying has to stop?
Well, it was the assistant administrator for the Office of International Activities, William Nitze, from the Nitze family, as well as the underlings, the supervisors, who all gave me the message that if you continue to ask these questions, your career at EPA will be a very short one. And because I worked in the international office, I was used to getting phone calls from industry asking questions, and so we all know that it happens.
But you have documents in your book that suggest a direct connection between the companies and the governments.
You're right. One day I walked into my office, and my office was always locked because I had a security clearance. But this day I walked into my office and there was a document on my desk that wasn't there the night before, and it was from the office of it was from the White House. And it was in response to a letter by Randall Robinson asking about the vanadium situation and why EPA was not fulfilling its commitment to South Africa.
Randall Robinson of Trans-Africa, one of those who rose to prominence protesting apartheid,
Exactly.
getting arrested on the streets of the capital. He wrote to Al Gore.
He wrote directly to Al Gore. Al Gore sent a letter to the EPA administrator saying basically what's going on there. And before you send anything back to Randall Robinson, we would like to see it. So at that point, I knew that the White House was engaged.
Let's get to the question of whistleblowers today. There's two things I want to get at. One is the role of reprisals against whistleblowers, the
Right.
role of reprisals against people like yourself. You write in the book somewhere, it's a kind of throwaway line, but you say that you realize that the U.S., like the South African agenda, depends on a powerless workforce.
Yes.
And that resonated so strongly to me as I'm reading your book about a member of a workforce who tries to speak out
Right.
from within vanadium mining,
Right.
and the same within
Right.
the United States government. You want to elaborate on that at all, and why reprisal works the way that it does, or what's the function of it?
The United States government, particularly the federal workplace, is held together by a very intricate web of fear. Fear. So everything we do is surrounded by fear. Fear of your next performance evaluation, fear of hearing the wrong thing, fear of saying something that you shouldn't say. But the mother of all fear is the fear of losing your job. Because everyone knows in this country, if you do not have a job, if you do not have income, you are roadkill. And so the government uses that fear of being unemployed to basically keep everybody in check. And so that's the reason why people will look the other way when they know that there's lead in the water or mercury in our food, because they are terrified of losing their job.
In this case, you were part of an organization that helped to pass a bill that supposedly brought new protections to whistleblowers.
Right.
Let's talk about where whistleblowers are today, but I also want to talk about what happens after the whistle is blown, because we're in a situation today where a lot of whistles have been blown.
A lot of people are going to jail too.
There's a man right now who is being awarded a Freedom of Speech Award for blowing the whistle on U.S. commanders misrepresenting the state of play in Afghanistan. And the media kind of aren't listening.
Right.
You don't hear many repercussions to the whistleblowing. Glenn Greenwald at Salon talks about a Obama administration war on whistleblowers.
Right.
So what happened? Carol Browner, who you sued and won against,
Right.
went on to become Obama's chief officer on climate change policy.
Yeah, well, they're sending messages to people that we are going to protect people who destroy whistleblowers. That was such a clear message to everyone in the federal government, because remember, one of the wonderful things about the No Fear Act is that every 2 years, every federal employee must take No Fear training. Everyone. If you join the federal government within 90 days, you must be trained in No Fear. So what does this say to federal employees when the woman who is universally condemned by the United States Congress, who had a law passed because of the evilness that was going on in her agency, is resuscitated, recycled back into the White House and made the czar for energy? So Obama was sending a very clear message from the first day on the job that I will go after whistleblowers and I will protect those that try to crush whistleblowers.
And what did you make of that? I want to get your reaction to that Obama appointment of Carol Browner.
Right. It was a very, very, very dark day for me. Initially, it was just, how is it possible that someone who has created havoc in so many lives, destroyed so many careers? So I felt betrayed. I felt very betrayed by the Obama administration. But then I saw Geithner. I saw the whole other list of characters coming through, and I said, I got it. I understand exactly what's going on here.
Which is?
Which is that we have a president that's not going to be very much different than any other president, that he's going to basically follow the status quo, that there's not the change that we had hoped for is not really going to happen on his watch.
And has there been change for the vanadium miners like Jacob?
Unfortunately not. Well, you know, with every political struggle, there are small victories. Now there's showers at the vanadium mine so the men can bathe before they go home and infect their wives. So there's been some mitigation. They leave their uniforms at the mine most times. So the mitigation again. But in terms of their exposure, in terms of the environment that they work in, the change has not really happened. What they did was they took me off of the vanadium project and they put on someone who was focused on private sector initiatives, which was really the game from the very beginning. I was the Trojan horse. I was the black female that would disarm the South Africans, charm the South Africans so that they wouldn't look behind, they wouldn't see the army behind me. And when I refused to play that role, they had to get rid of me. And then what they did was to really pull off the gloves and say, this is who we really are. We are really here to sell environmental goods.
I was thinking of the Time magazine Persons of the Year 2002.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All women.
All women.
One who blew the whistle against the FBI, one against WorldCom, one against Enron. All women who, if we had listened to them,
yes,
we might have seen national crises averted.
Right.
Do we see in their lives and in yours the price we pay as a society for discrimination, for sexism, for racism, for not paying attention?
Well, I think, whistleblowers should really be considered the canaries in the mine. I mean, we are the ones that are sort of blowing the whistle and saying, pay attention to what's going on. And when, as a society, we do not pay attention to these kinds of messages, eventually the people who are causing this kind of havoc develop a new confidence, and their policies become more generalized. So because we haven't paid attention to whistleblowers, we have new laws that are saying anyone who blows the whistle, anyone who discloses government documents can be held in detention without a trial. So we see the government becoming more aggressive, not less. My message is that everyone should see themselves in a whistleblower. There's so many issues now that we've blown the whistle on, whether it's healthcare, military issues, the environment. There must be an issue that someone can latch on to and say, had it not been for this whistleblower, my child would have been exposed to lead or mercury, or the vanadium that I didn't care about because it was just black South Africans. Well, now they're about to site a plant in Colorado. So that when we fail to pay attention to these issues, the larger society really suffers in the long run.
Any messages to journalists who cover these stories? There may be journalists that say, we cover whistleblowers, that we hold them up as heroes. What more do you want?
We really don't have a lot of stories about whistleblowers, and I think it's because the majority of journalists work for the corporate media, and they're not particularly interested in covering stories stories about corporations that do the wrong thing. So we need more independent journalists like yourself who have the courage to really come forward and cover these very, very important stories.
We've been talking with Marsha Coleman-Adebayo. The book is No Fear. We're making it available today for Pledge Drive. To finally get a last comment from you, Marsha, looking back on this whole experience, you, the graduate of Detroit public school systems, with the ideals that you had that took you into public service, would you recommend it for anyone else?
To blow the whistle?
And public service?
Public service, I think we need people who are prepared to go into public service, who are prepared to serve the public. I would not have given up a single moment at the time that I blew the whistle at the EPA. It was a very difficult time in my life, not only my life, but that of my children. But I think if you ask my children what they think of it, they would say, yeah, she did the right thing. And now my son is working with kids in the inner city, my daughter's working with adolescent girls, and it's because of the struggle that they saw me go through that their lives have also taken on a new meaning.
And now you're working with Occupy Wall Street.
And now I'm working with Occupy EPA, and we have now occupied EPA 3 times, and so we're going to continue to occupy EPA until the smog regulation has been overturned. And as you know, EPA scientists have predicted that unless President Obama signs the new smog regulations, 7,200 people are going to die this year. We're going to have almost 10,000 unnecessary emergency room visits. The reason why the president decided not to sign the smog regulation was not because the science wasn't there, was because U.S. businessmen decided that it wasn't in their profit interest for him to sign the smog regulations. We must base our decisions on science and not on the needs of profits. So I'm really talking to parents out there with asthmatic children. You know, if you care about this issue, meet us at one of our Occupy EPA meetings, and let's make sure the president reverses his decision on this.
No Fear is the book, A Whistleblower's Triumph Over Corruption and Retaliation at the EPA. Marsha is now in occupation at the EPA.
Yes.
And thanks so much for coming.
And we'll stay there.
All the way up here to MIT to talk with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You can find out more about the book right after this.